You're listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place. Welcome back to part 2 of our ongoing series on Bath, North Carolina. I'm your co-host, Charlie Mushaw.
I'm your co-host, Michael Williams, and I'm going to probably find something to be a buzzkill about.
It's our dynamic.
I'm going to give pirates some love right here at the beginning of this episode, even though the last episode was the one that was about piracy. Amazing shirts.
I've said to you before, we were in a circumstance, this was in the before times, we were in a circumstance where a difficult decision had to be made. And I looked at you and said, sometimes we have to fly the black.
Yeah, you know, I respect the notion of people wanting to have a very independent lifestyle. People who make a living in an unconventional way. I'm down with all that. The fact that something is illegal does not necessarily make it morally wrong either. Sometimes what is illegal is morally right. But, there are a lot of things to not like about piracy. But I really love the shirts and I love the aesthetic. And I like the way that the ships look in movies and all that fun stuff. Sword fights, super fun to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. I still have the Jolly Roger hanging behind me on my garage wall.
Yeah.
I did not take it down just because I made fun of pirates. So we are up to 1734. This was the year that St. Thomas's Church was built in Bath, North Carolina, and it is still standing there, and it is really, really cool.
Wow.
Yeah, dude, it's so neat. It's this little brick building, and if you ever go look at it, people have been carving their initials and like various markings into it for well over 100 years.
Oh, there's so many story ideas there. Gosh.
Yes.
I'm going to go directly into the novel writing file.
It's really, really cool. And in the graveyard, right next to it, there is a 16th century stone bust from the home of the, I'm probably going to say this wrong, Marquess.
Yeah, that's the right way to say it.
Marquess of Bath, Wiltshire, England.
Mm-hmm.
So it's right outside the church. It's a 16th century stone bust, and it's still there. It just sits outside. You can walk up to it. You could touch it if you want. Please don't touch it. But you could. It is so neat. And the chapel, like the church itself, it's just open. It's like in the movies, how like you can just go into a church all hours of the night,
right?
Which is not real. This one it is.
Wow.
Yeah, I was on a very early morning walk when I was there, and I saw people just walking in like stupid early in the morning, and was like, what is going on? And then I read the little sign, and I was like, oh, that's nice. Anyway, super cool. Very old building, very neat that it's still there. And it's important to note that this very prominent pillar of the community was built in 1734 before we move on to our next piece of weird.
Okay.
Which is 1739. So the church was there in 1739. Now, I will say, if listeners are sensitive about 1700s theologians and the First Great Awakening movement, I am going to make fun of George Whitefield. Like straight up.
Okay.
If Whitfield's your guy, I'm going to give him a hard way to go.
Well, the First United Church of Whitfield is definitely going to stop listening now.
So, hitting all the people on this series. So, Whitfield's Curse is the title of this segment. So, the 1730s saw what is commonly referred to as the Great Awakening sweep Britain and the 13 colonies. Mm-hmm. If you're not familiar with that, it was a Protestant revival movement that introduced the world to theologians like Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, and the subject of our story today, George Whitefield. Now, before we get into Whitefield, while I was reading up on him, I found out that when he left Britain for the colonies to like bring his movement here, he left his congregation in the care of John Wesley, who is a much more prominent name historically, in my opinion.
We have Wesleyan University and kinds of things.
John Wesley was big into the supernatural. His family lived in a haunted house.
A lot of these people were functionally what today we might call Christian mystics.
So he was a huge believer in ghosts and spirits and poltergeist phenomena. He published a collection of his family's correspondence on the topic, describing it as letters concerning supernatural disturbances at my father's house at Epworth in Lincolnshire.
It's a very descriptive title.
Yes. The letters describe the occurrences. They're collected. They're available to read. I found them in a book by somebody named Sitwell, simply titled Poltergeists. It's a very interesting read. My favorite one is that there's a ghost that looks like a badger.
Oh, I want to pet that ghost.
So British. So very, very British. So that's the guy that Whitfield left his congregation to.
Okay.
As we explore personalities, that's just something to keep in mind. So Whitfield is a bit of a character. He's got a thick Cockney accent, which I'm not going to do because I think it's really annoying when people try to impersonate that. If you're not familiar with that accent, Andy from The Office does it very poorly, repeatedly as a joke as to how obnoxious that accent is.
If you've ever watched EastEnders, you've heard it.
Yeah. So he was big on theatrics, drew absolutely massive throngs of people through showmanship. He was like, he was playing stadiums. Like if he was a band, he was playing stadiums. He was a big deal.
So he was basically a traveling megachurch.
Yes. He was friends with Benjamin Franklin, which was weird. Franklin heard about this guy and was like, this is hype. There's no way he draws this many people. He went and saw him and was like, oh, I'll be. So they would apparently like hang out and stay up all night. And if you know Ben Franklin, Ben was putting them back. So they'd stay up. At least one of them was drinking and argue all night. They would just sit up and debate and but they respected each other. So like I'm giving Whitfield a bit of a hard way to go in my description of him, but he wasn't a dummy.
Okay.
To be clear, he wasn't an idiot. He was a showman. He slept in a coffin. Like
did he do that for effect, or did he?
Yes, he did it for effect. So he traveled the countryside with his horse and buggy in the colonies, and in the back was a coffin that he slept in. And when people were like, "That's really morbid," he was like, "I don't fear death. Do you?"
Okay.
So again, you see the type of person he was, kind of in your face, brash.
This will reveal some of my prejudices, but my immediate first thought is, okay, that's some charlatan stuff.
Yes, it's very showy.
Yeah,
feels insincere.
Yeah,
and I mentioned John Wesley. Apparently, him and Wesley had beef later in life.
Oh, really?
Wesley didn't like Whitfield, and Whitfield got more and more Whitfield, and Wesley was very Wesley. And the ideological differences came between them.
It's got to connect this also to the Carolinas in a different way. It's got big Jim and Tammy Faye Baker vibes.
Yes.
And like Jim Baker's, their dog had an air-conditioned dog house, and that was one of the things that people talked about a lot when they finally had their big downfall. Things like that.
That is George Whitfield, and he was super puritanical and hated dancing.
Ugh. Okay.
That was his big thing, was that he hated dancing.
Ugh.
Do you know who liked dancing? The people of Bath, North Carolina. Bath was like the opposite of the town in Footloose. Like
dancing is mandatory.
Dancing was mandatory. They had a reputation of a bit of a wild town between its history of piracy and, that was all behind them at this point. Sure. Still had taverns and merriment. But none of that is what bothered George. He went there because he heard they held public dances.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm really delighted to hear that I'm not the biggest buzzkill in an episode, though.
So George rolls into town and it's just like, I'm George Whitfield and I've come to save you from your dancing. And they said, we already have a church. Get out. So we left.
Amazing.
So he came back again later, he went on down the road and did his travels and took a show on the road, quite literally. And he's, on the upswing coming back through again. He was like, are you ready to repent for your dancing? And they said, no, we will not stop dancing. And, and they didn't take kindly to him. They, again, were just like, we have a church. We're not doing anything wrong. This is a community building thing. Please stop bothering us. So, as we know, George Whitfield was somewhat hard-headed and showy, and he did not like the rejection. So he came back a third time, at which point he was met before coming into town, and they said, you're not coming in.
Get out of here, man. And the coffin you rode in on.
Basically that. They said, you're not coming into town to yell at us again. You're not welcome in Bath, North Carolina. George didn't like that. So he made a giant show, and these are actual quotes that I have. Climbed back onto his wagon, took off his shoe, and waved it at the small crowd, and proceeded to place a curse on the town. Not very New Testament of him, but that's what he did.
That's straight out of the New Testament.
What?
That's straight out of the New Testament.
We're going to get into that.
Okay.
So if a place won't listen to the word, this is what Whitefield said. You shake the dust of the town off your feet, and the town shall be cursed. I have put a curse on this town for 100 years. And I was like, I have never, ever heard that you place curses on people. So I looked up Matthew 10:14 in the New Testament, which is where that comes from. And Matthew 10:14 says, and whosoever this is attributed to Jesus, and whosoever shall not receive you nor hear your words, when ye depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust of your feet. The next verse says something along the lines of, for their fate will be worse than you can ever imagine. It does not say put a curse on people.
Okay, but in the place where I grew up, I knew people who would do that.
Well, so if you read it in context with what happens on either sides of the discussion, Jesus was telling the apostles to quite literally shake it off and move on.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who are not good at taking context into account.
So then, this blew my mind. I did not, and this is probably the hottest takes we've ever had on an episode. And if we're upsetting people, I apologize. But you're not supposed to curse people. So I was like, what is the historical context for that? There's a biblical era Jewish tradition. And these are like the Pharisees would do this. Like this was, again, a very showy thing. Mm-hmm. If you were leaving a Gentile town and wanted to display your separateness from them, on the outskirts of town, you would shake your shoe, you would shake the dust off your shoes and then go about your business. Again, it's not a curse. Nothing about this is meant to curse people.
People are awfully good at turning things like that into, and so it's okay for us to do whatever we want.
So Whitefield did this. Whitefield placed a curse on the town. Said, I place a 100-year curse on you.
Just shaking it off and moving on. That doesn't have any pizzazz. Razzle dazzle and just moving on with your life, Charlie.
Here's the thing. Bath fell apart.
Oh, poor Bath.
There's a town to the north called Washington, and through a variety of factors, geographic location, the fact that the state was growing and more ports were opening, slowly but surely, commerce left. And when commerce leaves, people leave. So Bath was no longer the coastal hub of North Carolina. It shrunk down to the point where the population is now between 200 and 300 people.
Wow.
So Whitefield, for the rest of his days, it apparently, he said it at the right time for what was happening in the economy. Mm-hmm. And he basically leaned into it and said, I did that.
Oh, wow. I'm glad that he was so proud of himself.
Right? So that is the Arcane Carolinas interpretation of the Whitefield curse on Bath, North Carolina.
I bet that those 200 to 300 people, though, I bet they dance real well.
I had a lovely time. I thought it was a great town. I went to Ye Olde ABC and bought me some Scotts Point Distillery rum. It was great. Visited Goose Creek State Park. I had a lovely time. So anyway, that's an interesting segment from the history of Bath, North Carolina. The Whitefield curse.
Yeah, there are probably people out there today who are like, yeah, you get them, George Whitefield. And those people are not like me.
We're going to jump ahead in history, so that marks the end of this segment and our deep dive on Bath, North Carolina. We'll see you next time.
2.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thanks for joining us. If you liked it, give us a rating, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, send us an email and tell us why. If you're not wrong, we'll try to fix it.
And if you're interested in award-winning speculative fiction, including science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, find me, Michael G. Williams, at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com and check out Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com.
If you'd like to pick up some Arcane Carolinas merch, look at behind-the-scenes info, pictures, videos, stuff like that, all the things that get cut, check out arcanecarolinas.com, where you can get access to our Patreon, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that in one place, including the merch store. Buy a shirt.
Clothe your body.
Drape your body in our wares.
Be our living billboards.